Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Secrets of Flow. I'm Alexey Zheglov, speaking live from my place in Toronto, Canada. Today, just like the last week, our topic will be the agility dashboard, and we'll start with that well-shared image that I put in the banner for this episode. For some technical reasons, last week's broadcast didn't go well, and the best way to do something about it and preserve the recording was to simply redo it this week and re-record it. So let's jump right into it. Here's the picture I once drew on the whiteboard, and okay, it kind of looks complicated, but of course I didn't mean to draw a complicated picture, just a few things that I thought were important and how they are connected. So what do we have here? We have a couple of gauges that look like speedometers on the left and on the right. In between, there's a chart displaying some kind of function, and down below, there are several sliders that look like as if we had a music center and we could move these sliders to control the quality of our sound output. So there is a number of things here we could observe, measure, and potentially control, perhaps with some purpose or intention. So there are several interconnected things relevant to our business and its agility that are connected here, that are shown here. And this picture basically packs them all together. And now let's unpack them. So let's zoom in on the right-hand side of the picture, where we have this gauge showing the release frequency for, let's say, our technology product or professional service. What's interesting, the scale of this gauge is indicated not with numbers, but with letter-like symbols like UM, W, D, and H, which stand for yearly, quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily, and hourly. And also the sectors on this dial are somewhat shaded and highlighted. I roughly described them as continuous delivery, CD, or continuous integration, which is something that may be happening at a somewhat slower frequency, and all slower frequencies are labeled as like pre-continuous integration. Now this scale from yearly to hourly with these particular notches comes from this interesting source. It's Beck, pioneer of extreme programming, speaking about important trends in software engineering, particularly how the release frequency, deployment frequency is increasing, becoming faster across the industry over the years. And so he developed and proposed this logarithmic scale rather than linear scale from yearly to hourly. Logarithmic means every notch on the scale means the frequency increases by several times rather than by a fixed amount. So for example, from yearly to quarterly, that's a 4 times increase of frequency. From yearly to monthly, it's 3 times. From monthly to weekly, 4 times, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting, Kent Beck observed that various practices that may exist in your technology organization kind of make sense at one frequency and don't make much sense at another frequency. So it all comes down to how frequently do you need to release in your business? And if it's this frequency, then here's the list of practices that actually kind of make sense. And what's even more important here, because of course all organizations evolve, they don't just exist at a given frequency. Transition from, let's say, one notch on this scale to the next involves adoption of some practices, and those practices could be, just want to show this scale again, so let's say from yearly to quarterly, or from quarterly to monthly. It involves, or from monthly to weekly, as what he is speaking at this moment of his speech. It involves the adoption of some practices, and those could be both technical. They could also be management or social practices. It also involves deprecation of certain practices. And those could be both technical and social or management practices. And what's interesting is that some practices that were added in one of the earlier transitions, let's say from quarterly to monthly, may be deprecated at a later stage, let's say from monthly to weekly or from weekly to daily. And what's interesting, you can't just cancel them out. And that gives a great advice if you are a leader of, let's say, a technology department or a team or a technology company, perhaps a CTO, or a director of a group of people developing some kind of technological solution, that if, let's say, you operate at a relatively low frequency of releases right now, let's say monthly, and you suddenly want to jump to, let's say, daily, the best way to go about it is one step at a time. Set a target that is frequency maybe 2, 3, maybe maximum 4 times more frequent than it is now. For example, go from monthly to weekly. Figure out the set of practices you need to adopt and to deprecate. And that's enough change already. Once you get to weekly, you can set your sights on, let's say, daily or more frequent releases, and then you again figure out a different set of practices to adopt and a different set of practices to deprecate, and you keep going like this. Don't try to make it all in one jump, and that's a very important advice here. All right, let's, by the way, to look up this great speech by Kent Beck, simply search for Kent Beck Software G-Forces on YouTube. It's a fantastic presentation and just really shows everything quite clearly. Now, what I find interesting here is that he did mention Kanban as one of the practices being adopted in a monthly to weekly transition. And well, actually, like, you can apply Kanban to any process, and it could operate at potentially very different time scales and frequencies of both on the intake and output side. However, what I believe he really meant there was that if, let's say, you have a technology team that follows some process framework that prescribes, let's say, bi-weekly planning, that's a replenishment frequency, bi-weekly demos and releases, retrospection on the bi-weekly cycle. Oh, and your development time should also fit the same cycle between the adjacent cadences. Well, now it's a high time to actually revisit all of that. And here, I think I hear the dialogue here between two visionaries. Kent Beck redefining the software engineering, and at the same time David Anderson redefining management methods. That actually things like intake frequency and release or output frequency, as well as some kind of process in between, and how long it takes. These are all the basic elements of a Kanban system design. So those things could actually be your choices. And so when it comes to, let's say, transitioning from monthly to weekly, it really becomes important that you begin to see whatever, let's say, biweekly ceremonies you have in your process, not as methodological prescriptions, but as your own choices. You basically design your own process. You design your ways of working. You design your own work experience. Design involves choices, as well as reflection and revisiting those choices. And so it's important to begin to see those as choices and then revisit them accordingly. All right, so in between, we have a somewhat of a graph of a function, and it's just a basic sketch of a somewhat idealized best fit curve for what we typically see as distributions of time and process in various product development and professional services situations. And it's important to see there's not one variable, but perhaps two. And we can potentially break it down as how fast and how predictable, because one number is just not enough. Time and process is not a number with maybe a little bit of delta around it. It is usually a pretty broad probability distribution. Time can be quite unpredictable, so it's important for us to somehow be able to communicate more than one scenario, perhaps optimistic or mid-range scenario, but also the pessimistic scenario that is some kind of representation of unpredictability. And on the left, we have the replenishment frequency. That's basically roughly how often you can hold, let's say, a meeting where you reevaluate your options, all kinds of ideas perhaps, and you decide what is the right thing to build, and then you make that commitment, and now that idea goes into your product development process, which operates at a certain speed, predictability, and then releases the result at a certain frequency. And now something important to say here is that looking back at some trends that have taken place across high-tech industry, there's been an enormous progress in release or deployment frequency. A lot of, let's say, software companies were at like quarterly, monthly releases, some even yearly, and nowadays it's pretty much continuous delivery pipelines are the norm, and you can really deploy as soon as you finish any small chunk of functionality. And a lot of people in various companies can actually like talk about this with pride. Like this is a long journey they traveled, and now they're here. I mean, they can actually deploy multiple times a day. They are pretty agile. Well, in a conversation with a senior product manager at one of these companies who boasted of deployments multiple times a day and how agile their product teams are, were asked, okay, well, how often do you make decisions about the right things to build? Yes, you're building things right, and you deploy them 3 times a day, but what about your process for choosing the right thing to build? Oh, we've got the quarterly planning meeting for that. And that was an indication of a big untapped reserve. That we can actually, this is an untapped reserve of agility. We can actually increase agility in our business quite a bit if we can make replenishment decisions also frequently, and not just make it a quarterly strategy or planning or annual or whatever that slow frequency is. And that brings us to that speedometer on the left that shows the replenishment frequency. So let's apply the same logic. On the right, a number of years ago, Beck asked, okay, what would it take to increase the release frequency, let's say, from monthly to weekly? And there was an answer. There was a set of practices. Something would have to change. All right, so what if we now have a quarterly planning meeting? What does it look like? Here's a bunch of ideas, here's a bunch of proposals, options. Some of them have a good business case, some of them don't. The feasible path to build some actual embodiment of the proposed idea into our product and deliver it to customers is clear in some cases and totally unclear in others. Some ideas are, destined to become what's called, it was a good idea at the time. And we are at this big table with a lot of people, lots of proposals and ideas brought to the table, and the problem is prioritize everything pretty much. Use whatever formula or method or highest paid person in the room opinion, but whatever is your method, just decide, and that's basically your plan for the next quarter. And that's maybe not such a great way to do things. What if we could meet a lot more frequently and do this? Well, what would need to change? Well, clearly we would need a lot more transparent information. That, some ideas actually have pretty good business case behind them. They appear to be profitable, the market is there's some validation from the market that this is the right thing to build indeed. And then we could commit to it and send it to our product development pipeline, and it will take care of it and deliver it to the customers. However, perhaps with some other ideas that's just not the case. Maybe it costs a lot to build, and there isn't really a market for it, so it's a money loser, and we shouldn't be doing it for that reason. In some cases, there is very clear technical feasibility of the proposed idea, so we can almost automatically commit to that at the right time. With others, maybe we need to build some prototypes and experiment them and actually establish some paths to some feasible paths to actually building that solution, and that just takes more time. So we would need to make this information a lot more transparent so that we could decide very quickly at, let's say, our weekly planning meeting. Also, several decision points that any idea has to go through on the way of becoming, let's say, a real option that we could commit for because we know why, let's say at tomorrow's meeting. Those decision points would become quite separate and also clear. What are those decision points? Okay, when should we start actually exploring this idea and actually running some experiments based on it? Okay, that's a decision. When should we exercise this real option and actually start building that thing? That's a very, very different decision, right? Should we build this thing at all? And that decision may be also decoupled from the question, when is the optimal time to start? There could be other decisions, such as, is there a good business case for this idea? How much money is it going to make for our business? And is this idea technically feasible? And where in the company do we have technical capability to deliver on that? So those decision points can become separate and quite clear and explicit, and also form a sort of a sequence where you decide to explore some idea, you build a business case for it, then you perhaps establish technical feasibility, you decide to commit to doing it at some point, maybe before or after any of the other decision points. And finally, you have this commitment point when you actually exercise your real option. All right. I should say there is a certain word that I know some people don't like, but there's a history there, and this word is, of course, service. What is really meant here by service? And a number of years ago, a lot of, let's say, communications from the Kanban community, a lot of, let's say, Kanban training material, a lot of times, let's say, in the consultations with coaches on the Kanban method, you hear the word service orientation agenda, for example, and so on and so forth. So what is really meant here, and clearly some people from, let's say, the product world had some objections and some emotional reaction to this word, kind of as if it doesn't apply to them. What is really meant here is some kind of process of developing or building some kind of technological solution and then deploying, releasing it, giving it to the customer. Some process that begins, let's say, at the decision, at the commitment point, at the decisions. Now is the time to start building this thing. And prior to it, of course, there's the exploration process of figuring out what that right thing to build is. And so whether you are in the professional services business where customers simply place a request into your service, and then at some point you accept that request and you do the work and you deliver, and sometimes customers actually don't do that, right? Customer doesn't know to request a feature, right? However, you do have the capability to explore the problem space, to explore the market, to identify customer needs, and figure out what that right thing to build is, what your customers need and want, and then you make a commitment as if the customer, let's just pretend for a second, actually showed up and requested that thing. So, and then basically the same process follows. You build the right thing, you have key technical capabilities to do that, it takes a certain amount of time, maybe somewhat unpredictable, and then you release it at a certain frequency. So effectively, this diagram visualizes both worlds, where we satisfy customer needs with our products and professional services. And in order to go to market to serve these customers, we need some kind of strategy, and that strategy will imply certain capabilities. We need to be able to move quickly enough in that marketplace. We need to be able to build these things quickly or predictably enough. We need to be able to release them at a certain frequency, and we need to be able to make decisions about how to guide this process and which right things to build, also with a certain frequency. And the red lines on this diagram going across these four sliders, that kind of represent a somewhat idealized situation that exists in software, information technology, and some other technology markets, where we already got our release frequency to where it needs to be. It's already pretty frequent, right? Maybe even more frequent than we need to be. Especially if you have quarterly product planning meetings, then optimizing your delivery pipeline so that it can deliver 3 times a day instead of merely once a day, that's not much of an optimization. Your time to market, your actual business agility, how quickly you can move, will will become much better if, let's say, you cut that quarterly frequency on the intake side to, let's say, monthly. So on the opposite side, we basically have a kind of a mismatch. The market actually wants us to be able to make these decisions a lot more frequently, but we still have this inertia of holding relatively infrequent planning meetings, kind of assuming that agility is something that happens at the other end of the process. And when it comes to time, I mean, we could be maybe a little bit fast. Maybe our processes aren't just as fast as they should be. I mean, we could still improve that. Maybe we could also improve predictability, or perhaps we could trade our predictability for some other desired characteristic of our product or service. So to summarize this, if we think about, and that's the words to whom is the customer, the words at the top, we deliver something to them. It's some kind of product or service. And whatever our strategy is for that, it implies a certain set of capabilities. We need to be able to run our intake process at a certain intake frequency. Then there is the process how we actually develop our product or professional service solution. And then there is the output frequency. And those things need to operate at a certain scale of frequency or time. And if our current frequencies and times and predictability aren't in line with what that chosen strategy implies, then basically we need to improve that. And let's say in this particular hypothetical situation, highlighted with red lines on the diagram, basically the most important improvement would be increasing the frequency on the intake side. I just want to say maybe a few more things about what happens upstream of the commitment point, and again, what happens kind of in the funnel, and what is about choosing the right thing to build. Right, so I played with color here. I created some. So I visualized very roughly, schematically, some funnel that converts some very rough ideas into some real options. So as we explore them, as we run our experiments, we well, you can see the color saturation increases from left to right. So we gradually filter ideas. There's now a smaller set of better ideas, and of course some ideas would have to be discarded. So the saying "it was a good idea at the time" exists for a reason. And in this process, what do you do to advance, let's say, some of your ideas left to right to choose the better ideas? How do you make those choices? You make them based on information. Where does information come from? Well, if your strategy is a fast follower, that information basically comes from the market. You just have to observe what customers are already speaking with their wallets. Your competitors, who are maybe a step ahead of you, are already building these things into their products, and you can already see that. So that gives you an informational signal that clearly tells you, okay, this is a better idea, we should do it, and we should drop it. So you may be able to filter your ideas and promote them to ready options that then go to your downstream product development pipeline quite quickly and perhaps with less effort. However, if you want to be a market-leading innovator, you have to discover all that information yourself. So you have to experiment, and this is where the prototypes, the minimum viable products, come in, and ability to run experiments very quickly. And now I want to go back to, again, that very same big diagram, because we could also apply it to your experimentation process, right? So what you have on the intake, it's basically your decision-making process. Okay, what idea I want to explore today, right? And presumably, if you are this kind of product management or entrepreneurial kind of person, that frequency for you is like almost momentarily. You can pretty much come to work any day and you, okay, this is the experiment I'm gonna run today, right? So it happens almost momentarily. Then on the release frequency, that's basically, okay, well, you've run your experiment and you learned something. How do you use this validated learning? Okay, if you have a quarterly planning meeting, you basically batch all your validated learning for a quarterly release. This isn't very agile, in plain sense. This isn't much business agility in a 3-month batch of validated learning, produced using your very quick experiments that you design almost momentarily, right? So that quarterly planning meeting becomes a big constraint to your business agility. So, of course, that hence the motivation, hence why I called it the big untapped reserves of agility, is to increase the frequency of that meeting, of that decision point. And in between, you have your experimentation process. How long is it going to take? And this is where I should say it's inherently unpredictable process. Nobody knows how many experiments you may need to run to actually discover something. And as a customer of your own process, right, you ultimately consume the validated learning in order to make good product decisions about the right things to build. As a customer of this process, you may have to tolerate its inherent unpredictability. However, there is a life hack here, and a lot of inventors and entrepreneurs historically, since very old times, let's say the Wright brothers, who were the first to fly the airplane. Well, let's not go into more ancient history, but let's say from the Wright brothers and all the way to, let's say, lean startups of the 21st century, this life hack worked for them. Make those experiments as short as possible, so that one experimental cycle you can run really fast. And if you need to run one experiment, great. If you need to run 2 or 3, still great. If you need to run 10 or more, it's still great because each cycle is very fast. So yes, it is inherently unpredictable process, but you can hack it by strictly time boxing experiments and making them very fast. So that's again how this particular agility dashboard could potentially inform the choices you make about your process. Maybe one last thought about this experimentation and problem space exploration side of things and product development, and where this diagram fits there. I would say it is somewhat like in the real world, this is more often kind of fantasy than reality, is that you can have one side of the organization that operates on, let's say, quarterly planning meetings and quarterly releases and multi-months timelines for product development in between, occasionally spilling over into something over a year in duration. And then on the other side of the commitment point, you have a, let's say, very nimble, momentarily design a new experiment, run it in the space of a few hours or maybe up to a day or two, and then produce some validated learning and then do something with it, right? So, and then two sides of the organization operating on completely different speeds and frequencies. This is usually a fantasy rather than reality because because the two sides of the organization share a lot of culture, personnel, resources, equipment, some technological infrastructure, and they can be apart from each other by all these indicators only so much. So investments in downstream delivery, such as increasing frequency, making the process faster, making it more predictable, they enable that fast-paced experimentation that you need to do in order to figure out the right thing to build. So the two sides are kind of interconnected. All right, so I've been talking for 36 minutes, and the thing is I don't have to run the clock to the full hour, so this may be just enough for today. I hope I provided a good enough summary of key indicators of agility. How frequent on the intake side, how frequent on the output side, what about time in between, how fast, how predictable, that you can actually control all these four things. You can make some choices in your process if those choices worked for you in the past and they're not working any longer. You can revisit them and do some kind of incremental improvement of your ways of work and bring them in line to what your chosen go-to-market strategy implies. So that's basically the connection connection between those frequencies and speeds. All right, this is it, and now I'd like to just maybe make a few clarifications and announcements, and maybe just the most like loyal fans and most interested people who watch these videos would be interested in those. So I get some questions about these four metrics or indicators quite often, so I'd like to answer two of them right away. So one question is, how do you actually measure those frequencies? And that was one of the first questions that actually the vice president of product development for the company where I drew that diagram on the whiteboard asked me. So the thing is, this measurement is very indirect. So let's say on the release side, we can actually it's not so much as a measurement, but I mean, you can just choose it and make it a company policy. And you can choose to make it daily. However, let's say we're not really ready. Then what's going to happen? Well, we just changed the line of code today, and we pushed the button, we released it, and everything crashed. Right? So that means we weren't really ready to do it daily. Okay. Well, then we'll only make trivial changes, such as let's change the color of this button in the user interface. This should not crash the system, right? So we push the button and it doesn't crash. Okay, well, tomorrow let's change the color of that button again. And then on Thursday, let's change it again. Right? And so we deploy daily and the system doesn't crash. Well, here's a problem with that. Our customers, our market demands more substantial changes. There is a lower bound on the triviality of changes our customers tolerate. And so as soon as we try to deploy a non-trivial change, well, we're back to that problem that we aren't really ready for it. right? So the risk of crash is just too much. So we need to deal with that risk, perhaps with some regression testing, with various reviews and other procedures, and that's going to take us, let's say, a month. Well, that's the constraint on our policy choice. We cannot really choose anything more frequent than monthly. However, if we can figure out a way to reduce those deployment risks, rather reduce the time it takes us to reduce those deployment risks from, let's say, 1 month to a week, well, then great. That means we can now deliver weekly, and now we can actually change our policy, right? So it's no longer constrained by the monthly constraint, it's only constrained by the weekly constraint. Something similar can happen on the intake side. Again, we can simply set it as a matter of policy. And let's say we set it to daily. Okay, what's gonna happen? Well, everyone, just like they came to the quarterly meeting, brings all their ideas, proposals, pet projects, and whatnot, and there's like literally hundreds of them on the table. And we're not going to finish this planning meeting before the end of the day. Or even if we somehow finish it before lunch, no one will be in the mood to repeat the exercise the next day. And then 4 more days this week, right? So something will need to change. So clearly, again, our work environment provides the constraint as to what a reasonable policy would be. However, if we can make some filtering of ideas, some simple decision filters and decision frameworks that basically filter out some of the bad options that promote the good ones, we come to the meeting with relatively few clearly scored options, and from those few we choose fewer still. That meeting could be quite short, decisions quite clear, made based on transparent information. That meeting could actually take place a lot more frequently than quarterly, so whether it's monthly, bi-weekly, or weekly, daily to weekly may not be that much of an optimization. Now, of course, your policy choice is less constrained, and if you choose, you can actually set the policy. So again, instead of direct measurement, it's rather a policy choice and an observation what constrains your policy choice. All right, the second question, and this is something that was asked of me a week ago by one of the Watchers listeners, and unfortunately we lost the recording of my answer. It was, how do we measure predictability? So the chart in the middle of the diagram referred to how fast and how predictable. So what's a good measure of predictability? So the thing is, it's still highly contextual, and I would like to put it in, let's say, simple language terms rather than with a formula, because the thresholds, the fitness criteria are different for different customers in different markets for different products and services. And yes, actually a good example was that entrepreneur or inventor who's basically the customer of their own experimentation process, and that process is inherently unpredictable, but it is fit for purpose because you get something on the flip side for all unpredictability, and that's the whole point, right? So it would basically, a process would defy any sort of simple formula. However, let's say I'll just try to define it by example. So in one particular company, the product development process, in terms of its time to build something, was like this. The best case is about a month, the average case is about 4 months, and the worst case observed was about 8 months. Simple enough, right? So what do we do? Is this predictable, unpredictable? Well, okay, what's the fitness threshold? Well, actually, customer expectations were about maybe 1 to 2 months, let's say a month and a half. So, well, clearly this process is slow across the board. So investments in like trimming the tail are not gonna do much here. If we, let's say, reduce the pessimistic scenario from 8 months to 6, it isn't really cutting it by the actual customer fitness criteria. It's not making any difference. We're not actually carrying anything across the fitness threshold, right? So this service just basically has to be sped up across the board, and there were ways to do that. However, let's say the performance of this product development process was different. Let's say it actually delivered in a month or two. Let's say 2 being kind of a representative kind of 2 months mid-range case. But it also had the pessimistic scenario of 5 to 6 months. Now, we could call this service reasonably fast, like it's moderately fast, possibly quite fast enough by customer fitness criteria, but it's clearly unpredictable. And it's unpredictable because it primes customer expectations with its optimistic 1 month delivery and the mid-range scenario of maybe a couple of months, which is close enough to customer expectations. So customers basically expect this to happen time and time again, right? But then they get frustrated with those 5 to 6 month performances that this process repeats on a regular basis. Not in every case, obviously, but with regularity, maybe in 20% of the time. So the process has a history of past performances, or perhaps a customer can observe what other customers got. And then those expectations are frustrated by less optimistic scenarios of the same process. So the process basically sets expectations and frustrates them at the same time. So that would be, I'd say, a formula-free kind of plain English, layman's terms sort of definition. In context, you may be able to find more specific thresholds from your customers, what they perceive as unpredictable. So those couple of questions about how you measure the frequency and how you define predictability, I answered. And now I just want to finish with one small announcement. I believe starting next week, I would like to move this weekly show to a different time slot. I noticed that most people watch it as a recording anyway. I believe there is a value in a live performance, and thank you, folks, that several of them watch it live, and I know some of them try to watch it regularly. But the majority of views are actually not live, but maybe with a delay of a few days. Okay, so there is value in still recording these videos live, because basically I just speak my mind. It's a bit messy, and whatever I say here is a bit improvised, but you can trust this basically comes from a live person. This isn't scripted, rehearsed, delivered by an actor. This is basically real me. There's maybe a value in that. So I plan to continue it, but I will move to a different time slot, so tentatively Fridays, so that perhaps you can watch the recording on the weekend, or perhaps start your Monday with it. And that will give you some ideas for the entire upcoming week, as opposed to kind of interrupting it at the lunchtime on Tuesday. So that was my final thought for today. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. I have to think about the topic. I'll announce it in the next day or two. Thank you and goodbye.